Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. We're going to be talking, as you can see, about audience analysis for the next few minutes. The information that you'll see on the slides has been adapted from Keith Wilhite's book entitled Relevance in Preaching. So, audience analysis. Audience analysis is important. Probably more important than you immediately think. It's the spiritual, social, educational, and personal demographics of your congregation must shape the content of your sermon. If you've ever had the experience of going to preach someplace as a guest preacher, and you've assumed the audience is of one demographic makeup, and then you get there and find that it's completely different, suddenly there's no relevance in your sermon. I was invited one time to give a Valentine's Day message to a group of folks at a church that were meeting for dinner and ministry, and I prepared the message thinking everybody would be more or less like myself. And when I got there, everyone was over 70. And so it did not go very well. I learned the importance of audience analysis through a painful experience. So, is that true or false? Well, it is definitely true. So, you need to analyze your congregation. You need to know who you're preaching to. And as a result, you first begin with spiritual demographics. What is your congregation like spiritually? Are there any unsaved in your congregation? And if there are there folks with some interest, or are there folks that are seekers, that are coming really with an interest to find out if the gospel is true? So, spiritual demographics with, first of all, are there unsaved? And then, are there, of the saved folks that are there, how mature are they? What's the percentage of people who have been a Christian less than a year, or over 3 years, or over 5 years, or, as we get to it, over 10 years, and then over 20 years? So that as you think through your congregation, how spiritually mature are they? How long have they been a believer? But not just how long, but what background have they come from? Are they predominantly unchurched? Are there a number of folks that are from a Catholic background, or a number of folks from a mainline Protestant background? It'll make a difference as you think through the what they have been exposed to and some error that they might have accepted as truth that you need to carefully not necessarily preach against, but preach the truth to correct error. And then from an evangelical background, or maybe even a non-Christian religion, find out where they're coming from. Spiritual demographics also include the percentage of people who seem to be immature or carnal, the folks that are just on the fringe of your congregation. The percentage of people who seem to be immature, but they're growing. The percentage of people who seem somewhat mature, but stagnant, not going anyplace. And finally, is a percentage of people who seem to be maturing steadily. As you are preparing your message, you want to be able to touch each of those areas so that someone has a point of reference in your sermon. So you're not talking over people's heads, or you're not talking way beneath them. But you pretty much aim to the middle, and then with opportunities to include information that will appeal to the spiritually mature and yet not exclude the immature. Finally, a percentage of people who give regularly. And that is a significant indication of where they are spiritually. And then finally, percent of people who serve regularly. Usually that's 20% of your congregation. Then think of where they are biblically. How biblically literate is your congregation? The percent of people who have trouble finding the books of the Bible, new believers. Percentage of people who have trouble explaining the gospel. And folks can be saved a long, long time and not be able to clearly share the gospel. The percentage of people who have biblical concepts but can't quote the chapter or verse. I know the Bible says this someplace, and then the percentage of people who know the Bible stories and where they're found, and finally, percentage of people who know and can defend your doctrinal statement. That may be only your pastoral staff and your elders. So that it makes a difference. You can, with a biblically literate congregation, you can make reference to a Bible story and assume they know it. But if your congregation is not biblically illiterate, then you can't take anything for granted. Personal demographics now, after spiritual demographics. What percentage of the congregation is age 5 to 12? How many children? 13 to 18, how many youth? 19 to 22, how many college-age kids are there? 23 to 30, young adults. 31 to 40, folks with young families. 41 to 55, folks with kids in high school and college, and then you begin to move up into the senior ranks. So again, it's important to know how what the demographic makeup of your congregation is age-wise. Usually you as a pastor can speak to the middle of the congregation and folks your age and some younger and some older. That's why a youth pastor can be so effective and to help fill in the blanks. Personal demographics also include the percentage of men and women in your congregation. Gentlemen, make sure when you have illustrations that your illustrations aren't only aimed at men like yourself, that you're not guilty of only using sports illustrations, but look specifically for illustrations that will be aimed at the women in your congregation, because by and large, most of our churches have a higher percentage of women than men. And then what percentage are married, divorced, or never married, or divorced and remarried, or widowed? It's good to be aware of the marital makeup of your congregation as well. Personal demographics, what percent of the congregation lives within a mile of your church property, within 1 to 5 miles, 6 to 10 miles, or over 10 miles. That's helpful information, not merely for preaching, but also for planning events. I pastored a church one time where we discovered that the church was kind of in the middle of a donut, and the donut was getting bigger and bigger. Nobody lived near the church. Nobody lived closer than 5 miles from the church. And we began to have to think about relocating so we could be closer to the center of our congregation. Personal demographics also include ethnic makeup. What percentage of your church is African American, Asian, Caucasian, Hispanic, or other? More and more, especially in urban congregations, we're finding mixed ethnic groups in the church, and we'd love to see more of that. It's just difficult to pull off. And if you're really aiming to move in that direction, it's got to be reflected in the pastoral staff. Educational demographics, what percent in your congregation don't even have a high school diploma, have a high school education or an equivalent, are college graduates, or have a graduate degree. It will make a difference as to how you craft your sermon. If you are speaking to an educated audience, they'll be very noticeable. They'll be very prone to notice any kind of grammatical mistakes that you make, any mistakes that you make in pronunciation or enunciation. Socioeconomic demographics, what percentage work in white-collar or blue-collar occupations. We'll explore that a bit later in this lecture. What percentage are retired, and what percentage is unemployed? What is the approximate mean annual household income? And that, again, is helpful for your board to know so that they can plan a realistic annual budget. So audience analysis moves from just those demographics now to a broader concept of class structure. I think you'll be able to see the relevance of class structure in audience analysis as we go on through this lecture. First of all, we start with the upper class. And quite honestly, most of us will not pastor churches that have folks that are truly upper class in them. Upper class have the most money, clearly. They have the most freedom economically. The upper class are old money. Upper class folks don't necessarily work. They manage their money. Old money, investments, hidden wealth. You can't see their house from the street. At the lower end of the upper class are new money, people that have acquired wealth and are now managing their wealth. They've worked up into that position of being upper class, and it's rather showy wealth. You can tell that they've got a lot of money. Now, why aren't they in our churches? There may be some exceptions, but by and large, upper class folks attend to churches that don't demand anything of them personally. Most upper class folks, this is a generalization, but it's generally true, attend an Episcopal church. High church, they can give, they can support, but they're not expected to give their time. And they can be anonymous. Folks with a lot of money are worried that people want to get to know them to get something from them. So they tend to attend a church that doesn't demand much of them. Like the Queen of England attends the British form of the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. And now the middle class, upper middle class, are professionals, doctors, lawyers, financial planners, bankers, professionals, or individuals that maybe have an individual business that has succeeded well. And class structure doesn't depend so much on wealth as it depends on how people in general view you, the status that you have. Now, some of us growing up might have thought a doctor or a surgeon would be, they're in the upper class. No, they're just in the upper end of the middle class because they're still working for a living. At the lower end of the middle class are school teachers. What is a professional? A professional is someone that controls a body of material, a body of information, expertise in an area that has required a significant time and effort to master. Again, a doctor, a lawyer, a pastor is a professional. A professional defines themselves by their profession. I'm a pastor. I'm always a pastor. A doctor is always a doctor. And then we get to the working class. Upper working class, those that work with respect, working with respect, and then the lower end of the working class, laboring without respect. Now, the upper end of working class may make more than a lot of middle class people as far as annual income. That someone with expertise as an electrician or as a plumber, who then can move from that working with respect at the upper levels there and making money. Once he opens up his own business, then he moves up to that professional level of an individualist running his own business. So why is that important in your congregation? Let's take a look at the next slide. We live in a middle-class society. The middle class makes the laws. Social class affects value orientation or one's convictions about what is important. For example, working class folks place a high value on manual skills, the ability to fix something yourself, and less value on formal education. Folks that are working class in your congregation will make excellent deacons that will roll up their sleeves and get the job done, that will volunteer, will be there, folks that you can depend upon. And they may, in fact, you don't have to be a pastor very long if you don't have those skills to experience some folks. Well, it's okay, Pastor. I know you don't know how to do that. I'll do it for you. Not valuing education as much as the ability to get it done yourself. And we'll almost brag about, hey, I never take my car to a mechanic. I fix it myself. Good to have working class folks in your church. Middle class places less value on manual skills and more value on formal education, middle class value. Someone that's middle class often will say, look, I don't have the time to fix that. I'm going to get somebody I'd rather pay for it to be fixed and have it done right. And that value on education, on a graduate degree. So here's an example of different class values. How do you answer the question, why do you go to college? What's the working class answer? The working class answer might be, I don't think it's important to go to college. I want to get the skills I need. I want to be an electrician. I want to be a plumber. Skill is more important than higher education. Middle class would say, why do I want to go to college? So that I can get a good job and support my family. So that I can get a job that will pay me enough so that I have some freedom and that I'm freed from just an hourly wage, that I can make a salary and make a better life for my family. And why would an upper class person go to college? Not to get a better job, but to go to the kind of college where they'd make the kinds of contacts that would help them later in life, to network with the families of other wealthy people. Interesting. And then how do you define yourself? A working class person who works at a factory might not say that, might not define himself as a factory worker. He could say he would define himself perhaps as a machinist or perhaps as a foreman. But working class people tend to define themselves not by their work, because their work is something they have to do so that they can do the thing that they want to do. They tend to define themselves by their avocation. I'm a bowler. I'm in a bowling league. I'm a fisherman. I'm a hunter. That's who I am. And I work down at the shop as well. Tend to define themselves by their avocation rather than their vocation. Whereas a professional would say, hey, I'm a teacher. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I'm a pastor. You as a pastor are a professional. So who is the most conscious of social class? Well, the upper class and the lower class, those at the top and bottom of the spectrum. Upper class are very careful, by and large, to only associate with other upper class folks. They want to be protected from folks and tend to marry within that same class. And middle class folks are fairly unconscious about social class. Kind of oblivious of it, but you can recognize it. And then working class tend to feel, ooh, if I go there, I'll feel out of place. When I pastored in Houston, there was an apartment complex right across the street from the church. We had ministry with their children in a daycare and after school and homework program, but we could never get any of their parents to come to our church because of the cars in our parking lot. They just felt like they wouldn't fit in. So what are middle class values? If we live in a country that's basically middle class, well, first of all, high aspirations to get ahead, to be successful, to achieve. Why do you go to college? To get ahead. A general respect for property is a middle class value. Individual initiative, I'm self-motivated. Development of athletic skills, music, art, and languages. I said athletic, I mean aesthetic skills, sorry. To be a well-rounded person. Manners are important to the middle class. Being a volunteer is important. Control of violence and physical aggression. Recreation tends to be planned and for instruction. How many of you as kids went to a national park for your vacation, or went someplace that had historic value, so that it was both recreation and a learning experience? Productivity is an important middle class value. Doing nothing is a waste of time. And cleanliness. So why are these things important? How do they help you with audience analysis? It can help you with application and relevancy, where you can look at these things and does your passage speak to any of these? And are these correct? Are these biblical values? Or can they be biblical values if they are directed and controlled? Basically, you will be speaking to a middle class congregation. We would like to think that we could embrace everyone at our church family, and we work to do that. But by and large, folks, socioeconomics is a greater determiner of where folks will go to church, even more than race. As you are aware of that and can speak to that in your church family, as you know who you are preaching to, you will find that your illustrations and your application will be more on target and more relevant, because it is true that the spiritual, social, economic, and educational level of your church family should and must control and direct the content of your message.